Not every rebellion is bad. British oppression and taxation without representation justified the rebellion of American colonists against King George III. A quest for liberty and freedom likewise justified the 1821 to 1829 Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. T.E. Lawrence's efforts to spark the Arab Rebellion during World War I became the stuff of legend. In recent years, many Americans and Europeans cheered the Arab Spring masses who ousted Tunisian dictator Zine el Abidine Ben Ali, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, and Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. Not even Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's al-Qaeda past could blunt the enthusiasm with which many in Washington greeted its ouster of Bashar al-Assad. Often, however, European and American policymakers automatically or arbitrarily castigate rebellions and insurgencies as counter to freedom and U.S. interests. Finnish and Norwegian authorities have respectively arrested Simon Ekpa, expatriate leader of the Biafra cause in Nigeria, and Cho Lucas Yaba, president of the Ambazonia Governing Council in Cameroon. They may have done so at the diplomatic request of the Nigerian and Cameroonian governments. But they are effectively prioritizing diplomatic etiquette over one of the most brutal anti-Christian regimes in Nigeria and an anti-Anglophone dictatorship in Cameroon. The State Department, too, rejects rebellions that, on their face, they should support. Consider the fighting in the Democratic Republic of Congo's North Kivu province. The current rebellion has roots in the 1994 anti-Tutsi genocide in Rwanda. Certainly, Kagame's efforts to oust the genocidal Hutu regime were just. After Paul Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Front pushed the genocidaires into eastern Congo, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees allowed the Hutus who slaughtered Tutsis based on their ethnicity to settle armed into the camps. UN camps became catalysts to incite a new generation. They were the fuel in fire. Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi was the match. He rose to power not by winning a legitimate election but by buying off votes after the fact. Tshisekedi floundered through his first term. He could point to no real achievements. As he began campaigning for re-election, then, he turned to ethnic incitement to distract Congolese away from him by turning them against each other. It was a dangerous strategy given the fragility of society and the history of civil war. Congolese Tutsis woke up to find night letters demanding they abandon land they farmed for well over a century or face murder and rape. As violence increased, in 2012, the March 23 movement, M23, formed to fight after the Congolese government failed to implement a 2009 peace treaty. I spent a portion of August 2024 embedded with the M23 in North Kivu. What I saw among ordinary people was far less fear of the group than I had seen among other Congolese during a previous visit to Kinshasa. Many appeared relieved they no longer faced Tshisekedi's ruinous taxes, nor the random shakedowns that left farmers hungry. While a small group of activists and academics argue that Rwanda directs M23, they substitute repetition and volume for appreciation of regional nuance. Many Congolese spent time in Rwanda as refugees but returned to North Kivu, where their families resided since the 18th century. While the UN has accused Rwanda of deploying forces into North Kivu, most UN officials cannot tell the difference between a Rwandan Tutsi and a Congolese one. It is telling that through months of fighting, Tshisekedi's government cannot produce any captured Rwandan or the body of any Rwandan soldier allegedly killed in Congo. Nor are accusations of Rwandan looting anything more than exaggeration. What the State Department says is looting, businessmen in eastern Congo say is normal business. They trade their goods across the border into Uganda and Rwanda because customs duties are an order of magnitude lower than the internal taxes they would pay to transport goods to Kinshasa. Rather than condemn rebels, Washington should recognize that what the rebels in eastern Congo face are the same groupings that perpetrated genocide or now cheer it on. Rather than side with a corrupt Congolese government that cultivates China and whose dictator seeks an illicit third term, Washington should be blunt. The city of Goma would be better under M23 control as capital of a federal region, not unlike Iraqi Kurdistan. Rather than condemn the rebels, the United States, Europe, and African states should work with them to build their capacity and help them govern freely and fairly. Congo deserves better than Tshisekedi. The rebels may be how they achieve a fairer, freer, and more prosperous future.
You have to start.
Rubio should reconfigure the State Department for a 21st century world. Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio will likely sail through his confirmation hearings and is likely to take the helm of his department long before the Senate confirms his fellow cabinet members. Frankly, he will need the time. Not only has his predecessor Antony Blinken been perhaps the most naive and least effective Secretary of State since Frank Kellogg a century ago, but too many of his immediate predecessors have focused more on travel for travel's sake than on managing an increasingly ossified and antiquated organization. Simply put, the State Department is a largely 19th century construction that expanded in the 20th century, but too often appears out of place for the 21st century. A century ago, diplomats were not only representatives but newsmen. They cabled back word of events to decision-makers in Washington who suddenly had a global perspective but had few sources of information. There was no CNN or MSNBC. Reuters relied on pigeon posts until the mid-19th century, but even after, it was primarily a wire service. Only in the 1960s did it convert to wireless to expedite news and serve financial firms and newspapers. Within decades, cable and satellite television changed the information landscape again. Diplomats may still write and send cables, but seldom do they inform more than a common online newspaper would. Nor do ambassadors have the same clout. The US ambassadors in London, Paris, and Berlin are essentially party planners who enjoy free parking. If serious negotiations are afoot even farther afield, the secretary or president can call his counterpart in a matter of minutes. And, yet, the imprint of U.S. embassies and consulates remain largely unchanged. The United States retains consulates in Bordeaux, Lyon, Marseille, Rennes, and Strasbourg. Rennes has a population of 368,000, roughly the size of Cleveland, Ohio. The same pattern holds true with Canada, a neighbor and important trading partner, where the U.S. maintains consulates in Halifax, population 486,000, and Winnipeg, population 557,000, among other cities. Meanwhile, there are 46 cities in India, with populations exceeding 1 million, only 4 of which have a U.S. consulates. Africa is already a battleground for influence among great powers. President Joe Biden's final trip abroad as president will be to Angola, where he will highlight the Lobito Corridor, an attempt to reorient Africa's trade from the Indian Ocean basin and China to the Atlantic Ocean and the United States. The Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the second largest country in Africa, has 70% of the world's cobalt, a critical component for lithium batteries. In theory, in terms of wealth and impact on the global economy, the DRC could be the Saudi Arabia of the 21st century, if it were not for the corruption and misrule of incumbent President Felix Tshisekedi. While the U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa can communicate with Tshisekedi and his cabal of cronies, consulates in Goma or Lubumbashi could better report on both regional insurgencies and Chinese penetration. Or consider Nigeria. On November 29, 2024, Biafra, the subject of a 1967-70 genocide, redeclared its independence from Nigeria with its capital at Ibube. Its action follows decades of discrimination against the ethnic Igbo and the region's Christian and animist population. Yet the State Department maintains no presence in the region, and so relies on the perpetrators of the Biafra genocide to speak on behalf of its victims. The lack of consulates along the Gulf of Guinea coast also makes it more difficult to monitor piracy, the oil trade, and Chinese influence. The same holds true for Somaliland, the world's most likely new state. Briefly independent in 1960, the unrecognized country has run its own affairs since 1991. It orients itself to Taiwan while Somalia proper tilts toward Beijing. And Somaliland is a democracy while Somalia is a kleptocracy ruled over by a president selected by just a couple hundred clan elders. European and African countries maintain consulates or offices in the Somaliland capital Hargeisa, but the State Department operates blind. The same is true in Aden, the capital of the former, and perhaps future, South Yemen. Then there is Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian Christian territory that Azerbaijan ethnically cleansed in September 2023. Satellite photos and sporadic visitors suggest that Azerbaijan is systematically erasing Armenian cultural heritage. An American consulate in Stepanakert could monitor the situation and pierce the gilded bubble that Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev seeks to construct with Turkish proxies. If not troops invading northern Syria, a more permanent American diplomatic presence in Syrian Kurdistan would provide greater bang for the buck than, for example, the U.S. consulate in Zurich, Switzerland, one of 3 U.S. outposts in the country.